I just think part of the discussion as we go forward, we really need a priority list. That's how we've been successful at local government levels in getting people to support additional revenue. You have a project schedule and you're going to spend it here, here, and here, and you're starting to think about in that particular area what are the highest priority. And you can certainly find that through surveys with the public right now. But for us to be talking about something that's kind of conceptual on both fronts, what projects we need and what money we need, really is, I think, a task that is really beyond us getting somewhere in 1 year. I mean, we need to accelerate that kind of thinking in your organizations, especially I think in Caltrans.
A couple of things I would just say in response to that is that there are a couple of important project lists that are an expression of what we'd be doing over the next several years. The first I mentioned earlier, the State Transportation Improvement Program looks ahead 4 years on projects that are nominated by both regions and the state, and that looks ahead 4 years and is refunded every 2 years. And also on the preservation rehabilitation side, we have the SHOP program. The SHOP program is first expressed as a 10-year program, but then there's a list of specific investments that would be made, again, over a 4-year horizon. Lastly, I would just add that the Caltrans worked with industry and others over the course of the last year to develop a freight mobility plan, and that freight mobility plan focuses on the state's trade corridors. And it does have a list of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 projects that would be on the horizon that we would like to see, you know, to the extent new revenues made available for that as well. So there are some things out there, and certainly I think you're right. It's on us to be clear about what the money would be used for.
Thank you.
If I may, on the local system, there are certainly, on the local level, there's a lot of projects that we could fund very quickly if money suddenly became available. When we have not done a survey of our members. There's already over 500 local agencies in California that handle transportation. So we have not done a survey of all of those agencies saying, today, what's your project list? It's a rather enormous undertaking to do that. We can do that if we need to. But when we did that for ARA, because we were trying to show that we could get money out the door very quickly, there was about $6 billion in transportation projects that could go out the door in 60 days from our membership. I suspect we're not in the exact same place that we were then, but there certainly has not been that amount of money available. So I think there's some money that we could use immediately, but similar to Caltrans, any project that we do on the local system that touches the state system, we have to go through the planning documents, so we get kind of caught up in that process also.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Brian, you have the last word.
Madam Chair, thank you. Just one other point that I think is really relevant on this line of inquiry. When we passed Proposition 1B in 2006, that bond bill stated that this is a 10-year program, and it had something like 14 categories of funding. And then there was a process governed by the California Transportation Commission and the Department of Transportation to program projects in those different categories and deliver them in that 10-year timeline. I got to say that Caltrans delivered. Those projects were, whether it's the Trade Corridor Improvement Fund, the Congestion Mitigation Improvement Account, you can go through the SHOP, the STIP, you can go through several of those. But in general, they did a phenomenal job working with the CTC on delivering I think what was dedicated out of the $19 billion there was on the order of $12 to $14 billion program, and it has largely been delivered. And Steve's a budget guy, and Steve has to say we need personnel for what we're going to do, but if funding is made available, it will be delivered.
All right, I want to thank this panel very much. We look forward to seeing you at the Budget Subcommittee on April 16th.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, those of you that are on the second panel, please come forward. First, we have Professor Agrawal, who is Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at San Jose State. and also the director of the Mineta Transportation Institute National Transportation Finance Center. Welcome. And we need Will Kempton, who is the executive director of the CTC, Jim Arp, the executive director of California Alliance for Jobs, and Ann Mayer, the executive director of the Riverside County Transportation Commission. Welcome to all of you, and we'll begin with Professor Agrawal. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senators. By the way, before I start, I should explain, as soon as I'm finished, I will of course take questions, but then we'll be darting out the door to try to catch the train to get home to my son for dinner. So thank you
Is your mic working? Please press the button and move it close.
Thank you.
Good.
So again, thank you very much for the chance to share some suggestions today that will hopefully help you all as you think through the very challenging, many and complicated issue about how and if we can best raise additional transportation revenues for our state. What I'd like to do today, and may I ask if you could pass me the clicker there, please, is just walk through, first of all, a few ideas about a framework that I think can be helpful in sorting through the benefits and disadvantages of different transportation revenue options. And then talk a little bit more specifically about one of the criteria I'll lay out, which is political feasibility. What is public acceptance or likely public support of different transportation revenue options? So I'll talk through that in a little bit more detail and then just wrap up very quickly with a few suggestions about how the state might productively want to move forward. So first of all, the evaluation criteria. And you also have a one-page handout that just lists these as well. And I'll talk through these very quickly and just throw in some illustrative examples using gas taxes, mileage taxes, sales taxes, and tollings as examples about how we might think through each of these criteria. So the first is revenue generation, what we're here to talk about. But I would point out that not only do we want to think of the total amount of revenue raised, which is obviously critical, but also will revenues be stable and predictable over time so that Caltrans and local agencies can plan and budget efficiently. Thinking about the gas tax, sales tax, and mileage potential mileage fee, they all have the potential to raise large amounts of revenue, but they're all not necessarily going to be equally stable and predictable. We've seen that as the economy changes, in general, sales tax revenues have changed more rapidly than gas tax revenues have because driving behavior doesn't tend to change as quickly as consumption. So in that sense, the sales tax is perhaps likely to fluctuate more and be a little harder to predict. Tolling also, of all of these options, would raise less revenue and again is relatively difficult to predict. The second criterion listed here is ease of implementation. What would the cost and complexity be of collection and enforcement of any of these tax options? Now, gas taxes and sales taxes are both already being administered, and so simply changing the rate doesn't add any particular administrative complexity for the state. The mileage fee, by contrast, would probably, well, I'm quite sure, would be the hardest to implement of all these tax options, simply because it would require some kind of an entirely new collection process, which could be more or less complex, but is likely to be somewhat costly. And tolling, I would argue, falls somewhere in the middle in terms of the ease of implementation. The next criteria on the list is equity, a very thorny and complicated issue, but I like to try and at least begin any conversation about equity by saying, I think of it as, how does the tax or fee change the distribution of costs to transportation system users, but also change the distribution of the benefits of the transportation system? And important place I think to start when I think about the four taxes I've laid out as examples today is they are all regressive. Every single one of them is more difficult to pay for somebody lower income than it would be for a higher income family. So in that sense, they're roughly equal. However, we could argue that the gas tax, tolls, and mileage fees are all charged directly to system users. So there's some element of fairness in that, whereas a sales tax is entirely unrelated to the use of the transportation system, so it doesn't have that particular fairness element to it. We could also argue that there are more ways for people to avoid a gas tax or tolls or potentially a mileage fee than the sales tax, since people do tend to have some flexibility in what mode of transportation they use, or some travel is discretionary, even if much of it is not. Now, the next criteria on this list is one that I think gets less discussion, but is really warrants careful consideration, and I'm calling that transportation system performance. And the idea here is, does the tax or fee change the way people use the transportation system in a way that either improves our system performance or perhaps degrades performance? So we could think, for example, about the gas tax or a potential mileage fee, which both make it a little bit more expensive to drive. And research evidence shows that this does slightly, not a great deal, but slightly decrease driving, at least at the increases in gas prices that we've seen. And if we reduce driving, we reduce wear and tear on the roads, which can improve with condition of the system, and potentially it could reduce congestion, which could have other benefits for the transportation system. The sales tax, by contrast, because it is entirely unrelated with use of the system, doesn't send drivers any kind of signals that might lead them to change their travel behavior, so we wouldn't get any transportation system impacts from changing the sales tax rate. And finally, tolling has the potential at least to reduce congestion, especially if we were to use more hot lanes or variable tolling. Related to the transportation system performance criteria is what I'm calling promotion of interlinked public policy goals. In essence, does the tax or fee either support or hinder our ability to achieve other important state goals? So to give an example, thinking about sustainability, to the extent a gas or mileage tax makes driving that little bit more expensive and people perhaps reduce their driving, that can help us reduce carbon emission goals, which is an important state priority at this time. One key factor, though, to think about that distinguishes the gas tax from the mileage tax is that people pay the gas tax every time they buy gas. So it's a regular cost, and that changes people's behavior more than a mileage tax might if the mileage tax were not collected regularly the way the gas tax is, but quarterly or annually, some kind of a system like that. Research evidence shows that when people just pay a one lump sum occasionally, it doesn't tend to change their behavior nearly as much as these small incremental fees that we pay, as with the gas tax. Finally, variable tolling, for example, if it were to reduce congestion in a significant way, might bring us economic development impacts that would be valuable for the state. And then finally, I'll turn to political feasibility, and I think this is a room where I probably don't need to explain the importance of thinking about that, but we do need to think to what extent will voters, and obviously our elected representatives, support a tax or fee option. And so with that, I'd like to now turn to talking a little bit more about some evidence that we can think about when trying to think about the question of public acceptability of these different revenue measures. So I want to just briefly throw out two sources of information for us to think about. The first is the evidence we have from how people have actually voted on ballot measures asking them to raise taxes or fees for transportation. And then secondly, some survey research. In terms of the ballot measures, if we look nationally last year, roughly 2/3 of all local and state ballot measures for transportation money were approved by voters. So quite a healthy proportion. And then just looking longer term in California, we have very clear evidence that our voters are willing to pay more for their transportation system in the sense that they've approved local option sales taxes in 20 counties, they've approved higher tolls on Bay Area bridges, and they've also in some counties approved local vehicle registration fee surcharges. In terms of some survey evidence, I've been involved over the years with 8 different public opinion polls funded by the Mineta Transportation Institute. And 3 of the earlier ones were California-wide, whereas the 5 more recent ones were all national surveys. These have all been random digit dial telephone surveys. And most have had a sample, all but one have had sample sizes of 1,500 or more, so they're quite robust. And what I'd like to do now is just quickly share a few of the results from the most recent national survey, 2014. We asked people on their support for 11 different national tax options for transportation in that survey. And what I'm starting to show you here is the first thing we did was we just asked people about their support for taxes where all the information we gave them was the tax rate and then said it would be spent on transportation with no additional details offered. You'll see that when we asked about a mileage tax, which we told people would be a penny a mile, or an increase in the federal gas tax of 10 cents per gallon, not popular. As you see, 25 percentage points of people supported those. By contrast, the sales tax was actually a lot more popular, with almost a majority of people saying they would support it. And I take two lessons away from these very simple results. The first is that people don't see all taxes for transportation the same. They're not either anti-tax for transportation or for it. They see the nuance that perhaps some taxes are more desirable than others. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we think about what public support might be in California for different revenue options. The other thing that's interesting to me is that the mileage tax actually polled almost as well as the gas tax here, even though the gas tax is more familiar to people than a potential mileage fee. Now, the next slide, I think, though, is much more encouraging. So what we have here is we asked people about just the base case, the plain old 10 cents increase in the gas tax for transportation with no other information given. And then we followed that by asking a series of variants on that 10 cent per gallon tax increase. And so the blue at the bottom is the 25% support for just the base case. And then the purple shows you the additional increment of support we got for all the different variants we asked on the gas tax. And first of all, you'll see that there is a purple bar in every case. So every time we gave people more information, or in most of these cases, we told them the tax would be dedicated for a particular type of use, support went up substantially. And I think for today's discussion, the most interesting bar is that one on the far left. This is a sales tax or gas tax where we told people that that additional 10 cents per gallon would be spent on system maintenance, transportation system maintenance. And here, support went from 25% for just the plain old gas tax for transportation to 69% of people saying that they would support that 10 cent per gallon gas tax increase if it were dedicated for maintenance and improvement of the system. Now, we also looked a bit at different subgroups within the population to try and figure out, well, were there maybe certain groups that were, much more receptive to these variants on the gas tax and other groups that were sort of unmoved. And we found that everybody preferred the variants. And in particular, anytime we said that the money would be dedicated for a particular purpose, support jumped substantially. And I'll give you just one example here. This was the gas tax increase that would be for maintenance, and I've broken it out by political party here. And you'll see, yes, Democrats were more likely to increase support, but certainly Republicans and independents were also much more likely to support a gas tax for maintenance. And in fact, clear majorities actually said they would support that particular gas tax option. Now, just to summarize quickly on public support, what I think we can learn from both the ballot measures and the surveying work is that, first of all, raising transportation taxes and fees can be acceptable to the public, but has to be very carefully crafted. And sort of, well, what are the things we can do that we might make taxes or fees more acceptable? From the sales tax experience in particular here in California, we've seen that people are more comfortable maybe with local tax measures and also tax measures that include specific lists of projects. But the public polling work I've shared with you, I think, also suggests that just having a general purpose without actually listing out specific projects can make a tax increase much more palatable to the public. And purposes that we found really resonated with large numbers of people were maintenance above all, but also projects to improve safety and projects to improve the environment as well. So finally, just very quickly, what I think would be some fruitful actions that the state might want to consider in the short and medium term. First of all, I would say right now, raise the gas tax.